The morning was just as it always was. Familiar, quiet, almost perfect. Sunlight filtered through the curtains and gently spread across the wooden floor, creating a warm atmosphere in the house. I stood in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, savoring the solitude that the morning brought. The children were still asleep, and my husband, as always, was at a morning meeting. At moments like these, I enjoyed being alone with myself. The solitude seemed to fill me with an extraordinary inner calm. Every day began the same rhythm, a cup of coffee, toast, a bit of fruit. There was no room in my mind for deep thoughts. It was peaceful and measured. I placed the toast on a plate and was heading to the table when, at that moment, something fell behind the stove, causing me to stop abruptly. At first, I didn't understand what it was, but when I looked down, I saw the lid of a tea jar wedged between the stove and the cabinet. I bent down to retrieve it, but then realized that perhaps I shouldn't lean over too much. The space between the stove and the cabinet was so narrow that I was practically stuck. I tried to pull my hand back, but it was in vain. A thought flashed through my mind. How awkward this is. The doorbell rang. Someone had entered the house. Before I could even rise, I heard footsteps in the kitchen. Jeff, my husband, peeked in. His expression was slightly surprised, yet full of concern. Was he already home? How could that be? "Are you okay?" he asked, standing nearby, but his voice lacked the usual lightness that always characterized our conversations. He had noticed that something was wrong. I tried to joke it off, but I felt embarrassed. Everything was too obvious. I was stuck like a child and didn't know how to get out of this situation. I could feel him bending down to help, his hands touching mine, freeing me from the awkward position. After Jeff helped me free myself, I felt a sense of relief, but at the same time, a strange feeling of awkwardness. His hands were holding me, and in that moment, despite all the care, there was something in his touch that I hadn't felt in a long time. We both pulled away, but there was something unnatural in the silence that followed. He asked again if everything was okay, and I responded as usual, trying to hide everything that was bothering me. "It's fine," I said, but my voice sounded somewhat unconvincing, and Jeff noticed. He looked at me closely as if he wanted to understand something, but he said nothing. He just shook his head, smiled, and, not choosing to continue the conversation, went back to his business. It seemed like nothing special, but something lingered in the air. I remained standing in the shadow of what had just happened. That moment with the lid and my getting stuck seemed so small and silly, yet for some reason I felt uneasy. I suddenly realized how rarely we talk to each other about what really matters. Jeff was there, but more and more it seemed like we were drifting apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. When we sat down at the table, the toast was cold, and the coffee had lost its flavor. We sat across from each other, and the silence between us became more and more palpable. He was talking about work, and I responded automatically. I caught myself thinking that I couldn't hear him, that my words were coming from somewhere outside myself, as if I were speaking to him through a layer of water. He was there, but we were both so far away. My eyes couldn't leave his face, and I noticed how he seemed absorbed in his thoughts. He was talking about an upcoming meeting, about some project he had started, but I found it hard to follow his words. I, in turn, tried to keep the conversation going, but everything I said seemed out of place. In the evening, as we were clearing the table, I tried to start a conversation about what had happened that morning, about what I had felt when I got stuck behind the stove. But Jeff remained just as distant as before. His look, not understanding, was clouded by something he didn't dare share. It seemed to me that he didn't want to know what I was feeling. It was the moment I first felt that an invisible distance had appeared between us. It wasn't a quarrel, nor a conflict, just emptiness, and I didn't know how to explain it. I wanted to take a step toward him, but something held me back. With each passing day, I felt like we were becoming more strangers to each other, and I was overwhelmed by the fear that one day I wouldn't be able to get back what we once had. Anxiety grew day by day. I couldn't quite explain what exactly was bothering me, but the feeling that an invisible crack was forming between Jeff and me never left. We had become more and more like two opposite points that couldn't find a common language. It seemed like his attention was focused anywhere but on me. When we sat down for dinner, I tried to talk to him about what had been happening in the past few days, but he was absorbed in his thoughts. Sometimes it felt like he didn't even notice how I was fading, how day by day I felt that something was slipping away between us. We ate in silence, and I could feel that silence stretching, swallowing us both. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to start a conversation. But he barely looked up from his phone to answer. He shrugged and said everything was fine, but his voice was empty, and his gaze distant. I tried to pretend it didn't matter, but inside more and more doubts began to arise. I looked at him, and it was hard to believe that he still loved me. There was none of that warmth I used to feel when he looked at me. There was none of that simple desire to talk, to exchange glances, to connect without any particular reason. His eyes, when they met mine, now seemed so cold and far away. It was painful. I tried to find a way to make everything right again, but I couldn't understand where to start. How could I fix a relationship if it was already becoming unrecognizable? How could I fight something that couldn't be touched or explained in words? I found myself more and more often thinking that we were lacking conversations about what truly mattered, about what was troubling us. He was consumed by his work, his problems, and I couldn't even bring myself to ask him to pay attention to me. It was too difficult, too painful. We were both locked in our own worlds, and it seemed like neither of us knew how to get out. Jeff tried to maintain an outward sense of stability, but everything inside me screamed that something had been broken. I could feel an emptiness forming inside me, as if I had lost part of myself. And the more I tried to understand the reason, the harder it became to find an answer. The empty space that had appeared between us remained unexplained and boundless. And then, at some point, I realized, if things continued this way, if we remained nothing more than obligatory figures for each other, the warmth of our family would completely fade away. Something had to be done, but I didn't know what. Jeff suggested we go to the country house. It was his way of escaping the routine, trying to bring back what we once had. Despite my doubts, I agreed. At that moment, I didn't know that neither the trip nor the solitude would really solve anything. We chose a place by a lake, far from the city. Secluded, quiet. Maybe nature and fresh air would help us shake off the heaviness that had built up. Jeff drove the car in silence, absorbed in his thoughts. I sat beside him, equally absorbed. At one point, I thought maybe this trip could be a turning point for us. Just the two of us, in silence, without any distractions, we could talk, figure out what was happening. But as soon as I imagined this ideal moment, it immediately crumbled, like a house of cards. By the time we arrived, night had already fallen, and the forest was dark. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the sounds of nocturnal animals. I looked around. The house was old but cozy, with a view of the lake. It seemed like the kind of place where peace could be found, where I could forget everything that troubled me. But I immediately understood that peace wouldn't come to me so easily this time. We settled into the house, turned on the lights, and began unpacking. I noticed how focused Jeff was on his tasks, while I was just trying not to think. For some reason, the silence between us didn't go away. On the contrary, it became more and more noticeable. Even when we were preparing dinner, the conversations were brief, limited to the usual phrases. Pass the salt. Where are the knives? The water needs to be boiled. As soon as we sat down at the table, I felt that something important was missing. We were sitting together, but each of us was in our own world. I would turn and catch Jeff's gaze, and it looked as though we were merely reflections of each other, no longer seeing each other for who we truly were. We spent several days trying to find common ground, but something was clearly wrong. Time passed, and I realized more and more that this trip wouldn't bring what I was looking for. We were simply living side by side, but not communicating, and each evening returned to the same pattern. I would go to bed, and Jeff, as always, would sit with his phone. The next morning, we would again go for a walk in the woods. but all these moments were becoming increasingly awkward, as though they weren't worth experiencing. Then, one evening, as I wandered alone by the lake, the emptiness returned. It's strange how you can be right next to someone and still feel that there's a chasm between you. I stood by the shore, looking at the reflection of the moon in the water, but I realized that I couldn't find myself here, amidst this landscape. That's when I noticed Kyle. My stepfather was nearby, walking slowly down the path, as if he too didn't know where to find the answers to his questions. He wasn't a part of this picture, yet his presence was somehow quietly comforting. I walked up to him, and he looked at me in the way only he could. There was a special attentiveness in his eyes, as if he could read my thoughts. "You're not alone," he said, and I felt something soft tighten inside. It wasn't a promise. It was just an acknowledgement that I hadn't been forgotten, that I could still hope for someone who was ready to understand. At that moment, I couldn't explain exactly what had happened, but with him by my side, I felt a little lighter, even though I couldn't shake the thought that our life had become something foreign to me. Each day, I found myself spending more time with Kyle. We didn't seek each other out, didn't plan conversations, but more and more often, we found ourselves alone together. Whether it was during dinner, a walk by the lake, or one of those rare moments when we were both left alone. His presence near me became something familiar, yet at the same time unsettling. With Kyle, it was always easy to talk. He was attentive and sincere. His words always seemed to touch my soul more deeply. We talked about everything. Life. How difficult it was to adapt to new circumstances. How people change. How hard it is to be yourself in a world that feels alien. He spoke of these things in a way that made me feel as if his words were reaching the darkest corners of my heart. I began to notice that I was thinking about Kyle more and more, that his gaze evoked a response in me I didn't want to acknowledge. He was part of our family, but in his eyes, I saw something I had never seen in Jeff's. Real attention, a desire to understand me, to find the words that would calm and support me. Sometimes it seemed that he just knew how to listen, and I realized that I had long forgotten how to talk to Jeff on that level. It was as if we had become unnecessary to each other. Kyle didn't try to make me feel like more than just a woman, but his presence made me see everything in a new light. He was there when I doubted myself, when I felt lonely. His words, full of sincerity, seemed to fill the emptiness inside me. Sometimes he would just sit next to me in silence, but I felt how it gave me strength. We talked about everything, about what worried me, and I realized he was the one who truly understood me. One evening, when Jeff and I went for a walk, Kyle stayed behind. We made our way to the lake, and I felt uneasy from the emptiness between me and my husband. I could feel the distance between us, the sense that the connection we once had was no longer there. Jeff tried to keep the conversation going, but I didn't feel like talking. I found myself thinking not about him, but about how Kyle looked at me, how he spoke, how his presence was changing my perception of the world. But I tried not to pay attention to it. I didn't want anything to change, even though it was probably already too late. I tried to leave things as they were, as if I could go back and forget what was happening inside me. But the more I interacted with Kyle, the harder it became to ignore what was growing between us. From time to time, I would catch Kyle's gaze, and that invisible bridge between us became more and more obvious. I tried not to think about how he looked at me, how his voice sounded different, how he was present in my mind during moments of solitude. All of this began to unsettle me. I knew I couldn't allow myself to go any further, but I couldn't stop. Each moment spent with him felt like a test I couldn't pass. One evening, when Jeff and the others went for a walk along the lake, Kyle and I lagged behind. Everyone else walked ahead, and we found ourselves on the fringes, a little to the side. I didn't know how it happened. We just stepped aside, and suddenly we were walking together, silently, in the dark, illuminated only by the dim light of the moon. Everything around us seemed so peaceful that I almost forgot about all my worries. But then something in the air, in that moment, made me feel as though something important was happening between us. Kyle, as always, was attentive. He started talking about life, about change, about how difficult it sometimes is to accept that not everything can be controlled. His voice was steady and confident, but his words held such respect for my inner struggle that I felt something tighten in my chest. He talked about how the world changes, how people change, but at one point, after saying something about how hard it is to get used to the new, he looked at me as though that phrase was meant specifically for me. In his eyes, I read not just sympathy, but understanding. It was a strange, even slightly frightening feeling, the sensation that he could see right through me. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. He was standing there, and his presence became so palpable that I felt how easy it would be to simply close my eyes and allow myself to be with him, without fear, without regrets. But I knew that wasn't the way. "Do you understand what I mean?" Kyle asked, and I couldn't answer right away. I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, I would say something I shouldn't. His eyes kept looking at me with such focus that it became hard to think. I wanted to say something about life, something comforting, but the words caught in my throat. It wasn't like it was with Jeff. With him, I could always talk about anything, and everything was fine. But here with Kyle, I felt that every glance, every word was part of something much bigger than just a conversation. I took a step back, trying to break the moment. My feet began to move away from him, but he didn't move. Kyle stayed where he was, still watching my every move. It was strange. I felt how his gaze pierced me, how he wouldn't look away, and at that moment, it became unbearably difficult for me. I couldn't continue this conversation, couldn't allow myself to go further in these feelings. But I also couldn't walk away. That evening, that quiet evening by the lake, became the moment when I felt everything starting to crumble. I looked into his eyes and tried to understand what was happening inside me. I tried to understand what he was feeling and why I couldn't shake the feeling that he was not just Kyle. When we returned to the house, it felt as though everything had frozen. The evening passed, night had fallen, but the feelings remained. I could feel them swirling inside me, and I knew that it was impossible to go back to how things had been. I couldn't pretend anymore that everything was fine, that nothing was changing. In Kyle's gaze, in his words, in the silence, in the way he stood beside me, there was something that couldn't be ignored. That evening, everything seemed quiet, almost dead, but I felt something building inside me, like something was about to happen, even if I didn't want it to. We sat together in the house, and Kyle said something, but I couldn't focus on his words. My thoughts were consumed by his presence, his face, his voice. I caught every glance, every movement of his, and I felt how it all started to fill me. He suddenly stood up and came over to me. I hadn't expected it, wasn't ready for it, but something inside me made me not step back. Kyle was there, and his footsteps sounded so close. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't say anything that could describe what was happening inside me. I tried to avoid his gaze, but he still found me. "You know, I never thought I'd miss you this much," he said quietly, as if his words were meant just for me. And in that moment, a wave of emotions washed over me, one I couldn't hold back. These words were simple, but they rang so loudly in my head, like thunder shaking everything around me. I looked at him, and suddenly, in that moment, I realized I couldn't hide what I was feeling any longer. I wanted to say something in response, something that would explain why I was so afraid of these feelings, but I couldn't find the words. Kyle took another step, and I couldn't step back anymore. Everything I had been trying to conceal broke free, like a river that couldn't be stopped. I felt my hands trembling, my breath becoming heavy. In his eyes, I read something I couldn't ignore, an answer I hadn't dared to give myself. We both knew this was the moment when everything could change. There were no unnecessary words in that confession, no grand gestures. It was a simple but profound revelation that made me realize that everything I had thought about my feelings no longer mattered. Everything was changing in that moment, and I couldn't stop it. That evening became a turning point. The word longing on his lips sounded in a way that I couldn't forget. It resonated in my chest like something deep, painful. I tried to escape from that feeling, but it seemed to pierce me, making me freeze. There were no words, no promises. There was nothing that could explain what was happening. It was simply a moment in which everything I had once known about myself disappeared. The world around us became irrelevant. I lost track of time and space. I was here, with him, and suddenly everything that had seemed impossible became real. It was something I couldn't stop, couldn't control. It was like a current that didn't wait for permission. We were alone together, and perhaps this was the most important moment of my life. A moment when I realized that I couldn't stop what had already begun. As soon as he pulled away, I felt my hand trembling, my heart pounding wildly. We were silent, but in that silence, there was more than words could ever express. It was a confession we both hadn't dared to say aloud, yet now it was obvious. It was something I couldn't fix, and I knew that everything before this moment was gone forever. I was in a state I hadn't expected. I didn't know what to do with myself, with these feelings. I knew I couldn't return to my ordinary life, couldn't simply forget what had happened. And I couldn't shake the feeling that things between us would never be the same again. I tried to take a step back, but it was impossible. We kissed. The morning after that night was the hardest. When I woke up, everything felt different. I lay in bed, struggling to process what had happened. I tried to understand what it was. Not that I regretted it, but I found it hard to grasp how my feelings had changed and how now they could no longer be hidden. My body trembled, and my thoughts were in chaos. I felt that what had happened couldn't simply be forgotten. Everything was heightened. When I went to the kitchen, Jeff was already there, as always, preparing breakfast. He didn't notice me enter. His usual routine was the same as always, but for me it was a different world. I felt the divide, as though everything around me had become a little darker. He didn't know what I was feeling, and I couldn't tell him. I felt ashamed, and at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about Kyle. I couldn't meet Jeff's gaze. He probably suspected something, because we weren't talking. We were avoiding each other. He often looked at me, and I, not daring to respond, tried to appear normal. But inside, everything was falling apart. When we sat down at the table, the silence was even more palpable. I kept trying to find words that would somehow make everything go back to normal, but they didn't come. My mind was full of too many thoughts, and one of them wouldn't leave me. How could I betray him? I knew it wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just an accident. It was something more than a mistake. I was betraying not only Jeff, but myself. I had lost control, and now I couldn't figure out what to do next. My mind had no simple solutions, no way back. All I was doing was trying to hide from myself. Eventually, Jeff noticed something was wrong. He looked at me with such wariness that I felt my heart tighten. He suspected something. I knew I couldn't keep hiding what had happened, but I wasn't ready to speak it aloud. I was afraid of his reaction, afraid of losing everything we had. When I left the kitchen, I felt the guilt growing inside me. I knew I had betrayed Jeff, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the thoughts of Kyle. I couldn't understand what I was feeling, and that only made everything worse. Fearing that if I kept avoiding the truth, it would find me sooner or later, I decided I had to do something. But what? How could I fix everything that had already happened? I couldn't go back to the peaceful life I had before, because I already knew that so much had changed. I was ready for something to break, but I didn't know how to take that step, not knowing where it would lead. Everything started to fall apart the moment I came home and realized that Jeff had already seen all the photos. He was sitting on the couch, holding the phone, the very one I had left unattended. He didn't say a word, just remained silent when I walked in. I felt the air around me grow heavy, as if every word I said would cost me too much. He didn't look at me, but I already knew he had seen everything. I felt as though something was crashing down on me. "Do you want to explain this to me?" he finally said quietly. His voice was cold, devoid of the warmth that usually filled his words. I knew this was the moment when I couldn't hide anymore. Everything was laid bare, and now there was no room for excuses. I stood there, not knowing what to say. The words didn't come, and guilt paralyzed my every move. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, but there was so much pain in his gaze that I couldn't bear it. He looked at me, and I felt his words pierce through me. There was no anger, no rage, only disappointment. It was the worst thing I could have imagined. Do you want me to believe that nothing is going on? Do you want me to believe that everything is fine? His voice was so heavy that I could barely breathe. I wanted to say something, find an excuse, but it was impossible. How could I explain something that no longer made sense? I don't know what to do, I blurted out. And in that confession, there was more pain than in any explanation. I knew it wouldn't help. I knew I had already destroyed what we had. But in that moment, I couldn't take it back. I just stood there, unable to justify myself, feeling the tears well up in my eyes. Jeff remained silent for a while, and I stood there not knowing what to do. He stood up, and his movement was so sharp that I nearly flinched. He didn't look at me, but his steps were sure. He walked toward the door, stopped, and said only one word. Leave. He didn't want to listen, didn't want to discuss it any further. The pain in his eyes was something that no words could remedy. I couldn't say anything. I knew he was right. I had destroyed everything we had, and now it was too late to change anything. Then I heard Kyle's footsteps. He was entering the room, but stopped when he saw that something was wrong. I felt his gaze immediately find me, and perhaps he too understood that everything had changed. The three of us stood in the room, but now the space between us was enormous. Jeff looked at me one more time, and in his eyes I saw that it was over. He couldn't understand how this had happened, and perhaps he would never forgive me. I stood in the shadows, realizing I had lost everything. Kyle was silent, and Jeff had already left. The silence in the room was so profound that I couldn't bear it. The time spent in the house, where only silence now echoed, was the hardest. Jeff had gone to another room, and Kyle, as always, stayed nearby, but his presence no longer brought me any comfort. He was there, but in that moment his face seemed so foreign. I knew he didn't need to stay. He had already understood that everything had changed. I felt that his departure was the inevitable decision. When night came and everything seemed to be over, I found a note from Kyle on the kitchen counter. He couldn't say it to my face, but the words in the note were clear. I'm leaving. It's better for everyone. As I read those words, I couldn't hold back the tears. He was right. I knew his departure was necessary to stop the destruction I had set in motion. Jeff didn't say a word when I returned to the bedroom. He sat on the bed, staring into the emptiness, and I realized that nothing more needed to be said. Everything had been communicated without words, and every silence between us now felt like a painful jab, leaving bleeding traces. I knew our world would never be the same. When I returned to the room where the note from Kyle had been, I felt his words echoing inside me. He was gone, and I knew it was right. He had been a part of the life I was leaving behind, a part of the past I could no longer reclaim. In his eyes, I saw that he was ready to leave, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to let him go. We had never spoken about it, but I felt he understood that his place was no longer here. With Jeff, it was just as difficult. We continued living in the house, but we didn't talk about what had happened. We tried to find the strength to rebuild our life, but I knew that we were now completely different people. What I had lost could never be regained, and what remained could no longer be what we once had. There was still this empty corner in my soul that I couldn't fill. I tried to return to a normal life, but I realized it no longer existed. We stayed together, but something inside me had died, and that feeling wouldn't let go. I didn't know how to move forward. Jeff tried, but I could no longer be who I had been before. We were still together, but the feelings weren't the same. We still met every day, but it was as if we had crossed the threshold of something that had once seemed natural. And I felt that none of this was what I had been looking for. It was the end of one chapter, the beginning of another. But in my soul, there remained that empty corner I had never been able to fill.